Welcome, everyone, to the second edition of Carnegie China's Distinguished Speaker Series for 2022. I'm Paul Haenle, and I'm the director of Carnegie China. Carnegie China's Distinguished Speaker Series is an effort to bring together leading experts on international affairs in China to discuss current issues related to U.S. foreign policy, China, and the world. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by my friend, Anja Manuel, to examine several of the major crises facing the international order, and in particular, the implications of the war in Ukraine and growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, among others. Prior to the pandemic, Carnegie China used to hold these distinguished speaker events at our center in Beijing. But as the pandemic continues to persist, in particular in China, we've moved much of this programming to a virtual format. But it's a terrific pleasure to be able to host my good friend Anja today. Thank you for joining us today, Anja.
I'm so happy to be here, and I wish we could be in person, Paul. But
someday soon.
Sorry, I missed you when you were in the U.S. this summer.
Well, I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity to meet somewhere in Asia soon, hopefully in China. For our listeners who do not know Anja's background, which I don't expect it to be many, but Anja is a former diplomat. She's an author. She's well known as an advisor and expert on foreign policy issues. She is the co-founder and partner, along with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, in Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel LLC, a strategic consulting firm, helps U.S. companies navigate international markets. It's a pretty terrific lineup of what I would call long ball hitters that do some pretty serious and strategic work. Anja is also the executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Aspen Security Forum, a premier bipartisan forum on foreign policy in the U.S. The last Aspen Security Forum just took place in July, featured panel discussions with well-known experts and leaders on foreign policy. As I mentioned to Anja recently in a conversation I had with her, I watched almost all of the sessions online. And thank you, Anja, for posting all of the sessions online. It's quite easy to go to the Aspen Security Forum website. And I would encourage all of our listeners to check it out. There were some really fascinating and important discussions. Anja was also invited this year. It's been a great year for Anja, and I've told you that recently, Anja, to join the prestigious Defense Policy Board. And that's quite an honor, with other luminaries, foreign U.S. policymakers, former secretaries of state, former national security advisors. Anja and I had the opportunity to serve in government together. That's where we met. In the Bush administration, where Anja served at the State Department as a special assistant covering Asia to the then Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Nick Burns, who is now our ambassador in China. Anja is also the author of a critically acclaimed book called The Brave New World, India, China, and the United States, published in 2016. So once again, Anja, thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Before we kick off, just a couple of quick points. First, we do want to have the audience ask questions during our discussion, and I'll try to save some time at the end, or as I get questions, if they come in and they look like they're ready to go, we'll do it as they come in. But use the chat function on YouTube. And second, we'll post a recording of this discussion. If you don't get to catch all of it, you can go back. It'll be an episode on our China in the World podcast, and you'll be able to find this conversation and all of our previous online discussions on our website and all major podcast streaming platforms. So with that, let's kick off. Anja, let's start out where I know a lot of folks are interested in discussing, and that is around the Taiwan Strait. In recent weeks, tensions there have reached their highest point probably in 3 decades. And I don't think that's an overstatement. As a response, of course, to Speaker of the House Pelosi's visit to the island, China, as most everyone knows, launched a series of unprecedented military drills in and around the Taiwan Strait. They've launched ballistic missiles over Taiwan, and have mobilized over 200 aircraft, 50 naval vessels. They also, in the U.S. China context, canceled or suspended 8 military and cooperative dialogues with the United States. And in their new Taiwan white paper, first white paper to be published in over 2 decades, and I encourage listeners to read that, they removed a number of previous pledges. One in particular is to not send military personnel to Taiwan in the event of reunification. So some pretty big changes. And I want to just start here, if we could, Anja, just first give us a sense, in your view, how acute is the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait? And as you look at the Chinese leadership, how urgent do you think it is in terms of an issue for Xi Jinping, reunification? And how do you think the United States should respond to deter conflict? How can we be successful doing that? And managing tensions with China. So very easy question to kick things off. Nothing complicated, but let's start there.
Thanks so much, Paul. You and I will solve all the conflicts in the first 5 minutes of speaking. Well, I think you summed it up perfectly in preparation for this. Geopolitically, we are in for a wild ride. Buckle your seatbelts. So it's not just Taiwan, but I know we're going to talk about Russia, Ukraine. It's just the level of conflict and worry and instability in the international system, I think, is much higher than it has been in recent years, even. And just speaking to Taiwan specifically, you summarized exactly the Chinese reaction in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit. It was extreme by any measure. And I think China gained something very important from the speaker's visit. And that is, with these exercises, which are difficult to respond to because it's not a military attack, there's nothing you can really do, they're merely exercising. The Chinese have gained leverage over Taiwan and over us. They disrupted commercial shipping, they disrupted airlines coming in and out, and that seems like a trick that can ramp up and ramp down again at will. And at some point, does that cause real harm to Taiwan's economy? At some point, if there constant or frequent Chinese exercises around the island of Taiwan, what happens? Do people not insure commercial ships anymore? So they've really gained an important leverage point here. You asked about the risk of conflict. When I talk to my colleagues and friends at the Pentagon, I don't think anyone in the US currently assesses that an all-out Chinese invasion of the island of Taiwan is imminent. But there are a lot of other things they can do to make life difficult for Taiwan and to force what Xi Jinping calls in every speech a, quote, peaceful reunification. As you know well, Paul, there's an election coming up, Tsai Ing-wen, in about 15, 16 months. She's been a very unusually good leader for Taiwan, I would say. It's a little unclear what comes after her. There's almost certainly going to be election meddling, disinformation, all that playbook is going to play out. You can imagine a Chinese encroachment on the kind of outlying islands of Taiwan that are closer to the Chinese mainland, frankly, than to Taipei. And you could imagine all sorts of other things, a blockade of American military materiel coming in there. So there are a lot of ways that this can get uncomfortable and dangerous without being a full out invasion.
Yeah.
I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, I think those are all good points, and your point on the Chinese not wasting a good crisis to take it to their advantage, I think is a very important one. And it seems that they have been successfully changed the status quo of the activities that they're conducting now around Taiwan, and we do have a bit of a new normal, which puts the situation in even more difficult status. In terms of deterring conflict, there has been this ongoing debate in the U.S. about our long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity. That is to say, we're not going to sort of say to the Chinese in any declaratory policy, or any statements exactly what we might do in the event that the Chinese were to try to take Taiwan by force. But that also means we don't give a blank check to Taiwan. And I think some people often forget there's a part of the strategic ambiguity that's for Taiwan as well. If they think we're going to be there no matter what, you may have political leaders that push the envelope in ways that may run against U.S. interests. But nevertheless, there's been a debate. Richard Haass really pushed this forward in an article that he wrote, talking about maybe we need to clarify strategic ambiguity. Biden himself on multiple occasions has said the U.S. would intervene in a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, but then the administration has had to walk back his comments. There's proposals in Congress now, the Taiwan Policy Act. It's got to work its way, of course, through Congress before it gets to the point where it can be voted on. But apparently one of the proposals in there is that Taiwan would become a major non-NATO ally, which I assume would indicate some sort of commitment to coming to Taiwan's defense. How do you see the issue around strategic ambiguity? Should the U.S., as Richard Haass says, move to more clarity? How best can the U.S. deter conflict in the Taiwan Strait in this regard, in your view?
Thank you for setting it up so thoroughly. I believe that strategic ambiguity is important. I'm not with Richard Haass on this one, although I respect him. I know Harry Harris is out there too, saying it's time to just drop the strategic ambiguity. I actually think Biden has been kind of masterful in this. He sort of said what he believes 3 times. And there's ambiguity, but there's not really ambiguity in this president's mind, at least. I firmly believe that the Taiwan Policy Act would be a mistake. I mean, you and I worked in the executive branch. It's very hard when Congress meddles too much in the foreign policy of the United States in a way that makes it then difficult for the executive to maneuver and to have any flexibility. I mean, you saw that, frankly, with the Pelosi visit. I don't think anyone in Taiwan, in mainland China, understands or believes that actually President Biden doesn't have control over the Speaker of the House's travel schedule. And they don't. They're 2 separate and co-equal branches of government. It's just a very unusual thing in our system. So I would hope that the Taiwan Policy Act doesn't pass in its current form. I think the strategic ambiguity continues to be an important thing because we used to be what Condi Rice always calls a rheostat in Taiwan-China relations, where if mainland China was being too aggressive, we would tell them to tamp it down. If Taiwan was getting too close to declaring independence, we would hold them in line. So we were kind of keeping stability in that area. Now, recently, we've leaned much more in favor of Taiwan, I would say, for good reason, because Beijing has been much more aggressive in that part of the world. But I don't think we want to lose that role of a much more thoughtful arbiter in the dispute rather than just purely taking one side. So I do continue to believe that there's an important role for strategic ambiguity. And you asked more generally, Paul, how should we respond to deter conflict and manage tensions? I've said it a little bit on the diplomatic side. And I think that's actually what the Biden administration is trying to do. It's difficult for them right now, but I think that's the path they are on, and rightfully so. On the military side, I think it's quite important, and our military understands this, that we make Taiwan what Michelle Flournoy has memorably called a porcupine, giving them the things that they actually would need to deter an invasion or something short of an invasion by the mainland. You saw in Ukraine how effective that is if there's a motivated domestic group that wants to hold out, doesn't want to be invaded. And so for that, you need smaller things. You need missiles, you need small arms, you need things that aren't the big, exquisite platforms that, frankly, the Taiwanese often ask for. And if you talk to some Taiwanese military officials, mostly an older generation, I think there's a little bit of thinking there still of, oh, well, maybe we'll take back the mainland, so we need all of these fancy jets and things. That seems unrealistic, just given the size of the 2 countries. So I'm for the porcupine strategy.
Yeah. No, those are great points. And I tend to agree with you on strategic ambiguity. If for no other reason, as you described the Rio stat, we often, because right now we're worried about Chinese coercion, we're worried about salami slicing, the gray zone tactics, the increasing pressure we see being put on Taiwan. So, we're signaling more to China, we're pushing back more on China. I was China director when President Chen Shui-bian was in Taiwan, and he was pushing the envelope in ways that when we were fighting two wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, we didn't want that instability in the Taiwan Strait.
That's right.
And again, that strategic ambiguity, if, as you said, there's an election in January 2024 in Taiwan, who knows who the next president is going to be? We've had a very reasonable and moderate leader in Taiwan under Tsai Ing-wen, and we've been fortunate, as you said earlier. So I agree with you on that.
Exactly what I was referring to. That's right.
I just want to talk a little bit about, you were in the government in the Bush administration. You've seen China policy over quite a long arc. I hear from Chinese friends a lot, and you may hear the same, that they believe there's very little difference between the Trump administration's approach on China and that of the Biden administration's approach to China. For one thing, what they say is, look, the Biden administration has accepted this framing of strategic competition. And, prior to that, since normalization of U.S. China relations in 1979 under the Carter administration, every administration followed this conceptual framework of engagement. And so Trump changed that to strategic competition. Biden picked that right up. And so they don't see, at least in China, much of a difference. How do you see that question? What, in your view, are the main areas of continuity? And where are the policy changes, the important policy changes between those two administrations?
Well, I think our Chinese friends are mostly right. There's more continuity than difference between Presidents Trump and Biden on their China policy, some important differences that I'll get into. But there's continuity for one important reason, and that is President Xi Jinping. The policies, you can argue, it's a little bit like a marriage that's bickering, you can argue who started it. But unfortunately, we've come so far in what I would consider a dangerous and unfortunate direction from even when I wrote the book that you very nicely referred to that came out in 2016, when there still seemed to be a path forward for these two great powers to jockey along, maybe having conflict in certain areas, but cooperating on the big issues and finding ways to manage our differences. With Xi Jinping's what the United States, and I think increasingly Europe and much of India, certainly, and much of the rest of the world sees as a really aggressive foreign policy, the end of hide and bide. And with the reliance, the meddling in the Taiwan Strait, the increased incursions over the border in the high Himalayas between India and China, in the South China Sea. I don't have to tell you all this, Paul, but we're seeing a China that worries the world. And if there could be confidence building measures on both sides, I think the Biden administration in particular would very happily go back to a much more moderate view of US and much more cooperative view of US China relations. In fact, when you look at Tony Blinken's first speech on China, he talked about this, compete where we must, cooperate where we can. They were really trying. And by the way, and I would say this with all respect for our Chinese friends, in response to what they saw as a provocation, the speaker's visit to Taiwan, even though there's nothing illegal or wrong with her visiting, the worst thing to do is to stop talking. And I think that's one of the problems that the Biden administration has had, is that continually they make an effort at communication and they're rebuffed by the Chinese side. And I understand that on the military side, the PLA, Chinese military to US military, there were finally some really good conversations going. And of course, this mini crisis and kerfuffle pushed us all the way back. So I would say the US is willing to hold out an open hand and have a better relationship, but it needs to be done on a basis of fairness and a basis of reciprocity.
Yeah. Great points. And your description of the dueling narratives between the United States and China, the difficult marriage that is taking place, and it's a bit of a blame game, right? And I think many Americans see it as you've described it, which is, we're looking at a very different China, moving along a different trajectory and different set of policies, much more aggressive, many of which undermine, threaten U.S. and the interests of our partners and allies. But in China, of course, you hear a very different narrative, right?
That's right. That's right. And Paul, I would add one thing, because you and I are such veterans of, you lived in China for years and years. It's difficult for you to go back. Most of my friends, I think all of my friends who were expats living in China, of which there were many, have left because of COVID, but also because of the political crackdown, because it was getting very difficult. The track 2 dialogues that you and I were always involved in, they're almost all moribund. And that's not for lack of trying on the US side. And frankly, many Chinese would want more dialogue, but there's less and less space for open dialogue between the US and China. And frankly, there's, as you know well, there's less and less space for the Chinese to be open and free and express themselves internally. So it's frankly dangerous for many of our friends in China to talk to the likes of us.
Absolutely. And, I still think that, and, I have friends that maybe disagree with me, but I still think the track 2 dialogues are important. I think you're correct in that, the kind of candid conversations, the degree that they can be candid on the Chinese side, I think has been constrained in this environment. And it makes it much more difficult, but I still think it's important to do. And, it's important, frankly, that we continue to communicate. As you said, at a time where tensions are as bad as they've been for decades, the communication channels now are really closed down because the Chinese have paused or canceled a lot of that. And this is a long-standing disagreement with China, that when there are crises in the relationship and there's tension in the relationship, you remember after the EP3 crisis, Secretary of State Colin Powell tried to call his counterpart. It took him, roughly a week to get a hold of him. So, we see these things different. We want to open the apertures for communication. On the Biden administration's policy, you talked about the areas of continuity. Where do you see changes, important changes from the Trump administration? And just more broadly, from a 50,000 feet standpoint, where are they doing well, and where do you think the administration needs to step up its game with regard to China? And we've had now, Blinken's China speech. We've had the Indo-Pacific strategy. We've had the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is announced. So there's a lot of stuff out there. We've had a lot of diplomatic visits to the region. We were a year and a half in, so there's actually close to 2 years now. So there's a lot out there. Where do you see the strengths and weaknesses now?
Yeah, perfect. So 2 questions. I'll take them one at a time. On the differences between the Trump and Biden administrations, and I'm generalizing because obviously there are differences of opinions within each of those administrations about how to approach China. From the Trump administration side, there were certain people who had a really knee-jerk reaction. China's the enemy. We just need to be tough. And not a lot of moderation around that and finding ways through the inevitable disagreements. I don't know anyone in the Biden administration who sees it that way. The people leading that policy, from Tony Blinken to Jake Sullivan to Kurt to Laura and lots of others who you and I, many others, know and are friendly with. I think the goal is to find a peaceful way to manage China's rise and not to prevent China from rising. I know our Chinese friends often say that. Mm-hmm. The policies, the attitude is different. The policies have been a little bit similar because of what we talked about before, being so tough with Xi Jinping in particular in power, having fewer interlocutors. I think even during the Trump administration, the conversations between Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Liu He, Wang Xishan was a great interlocutor. It's harder below the President Xi level for the US to have good, meaty conversations with their Chinese counterpart. I think Jake has it a little bit with his counterpart, but it's more difficult. So that's how I see the difference. You asked about the Biden administration and what more they could be doing on China policy. Well, there's a big leg of the stool that's missing, and they've tried it with IPEF, but trade is just missing. And you know this, you live in Singapore. The rest of the region is trading with each other, and they're trading very happily with the Chinese, right? The gravitational pull of the Chinese economy is really paying off in giving them influence in the rest of Asia, understandably so. Now, there is a brick wall, I would say, of both Republicans and Democrats in Congress, certain parts of each of those parties that have become increasingly protectionist. And so there's not much to do on trade. And so when I look at IPEF, it's not awesome, but it's the best we could do under difficult circumstances.
Right.
And I think what it's meant to be is a side and backdoor to opening up access over time and getting us back in the game in Asia in the trade and economic side. So the digital commerce agreement across 13 countries, I think, is a significant step forward. It helps with some of the technology, friendshoring, the things we're talking about. So that, I think, is a limited step, but a good thing the Biden administration is doing. Here's another big difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Trump, I think, gets credit. He deserves a lot of credit for calling out the technology race that's on between the US and China, because I think a lot of folks, especially here, I live in Silicon Valley, people were very happy to do business with the Chinese and maybe a little bit naive about what was going on the other side. So Trump deserves some credit for that. His administration did mostly what I would call defense, try to build the moat, increase the export controls, create a new CFIUS, making it harder for Chinese to invest in some of our most sensitive companies. The Biden administration and Congress, to its credit, I'm going to praise the U.S. Congress here, has done the second piece of this, which is the most important, which is standing ourselves up to compete. No, it's not about tearing China down. Let's bring it on. Let's have a race. That's fun. That's interesting. Frankly, it'll help the world. But on the technology piece, I think we've done a lot with the CHIPS Act, and I know we'll talk about it in a minute, to stand ourselves up.
You've been out in the front on this, Anja, and you've been talking about this for some time. You were part of the Asia Society's bipartisan working group on science and technology and U.S. China Relations. You wrote in 2019 for the Financial Times an article saying the West needs a positive response to China's technology challenge. So message received, it sounds like. You also wrote the U.S. was primarily focused on competing in technology by cutting off its competitors, in particular China, and that the U.S. needs an offensive strategy. And so, compliments to you for being out in front and leading those discussions and those decisions. While we're on that, let's just talk about chips for a second, and then I'll shift to Ukraine before we open it up to Q&A. You mentioned, of course, the CHIPS Act, which was just passed. There's been the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's been other legislation crafted around, AUKUS, for example, EU Trade and Technology Council, just to name a few. These domestic and international efforts to compete technologically, why, how can the U.S. and its allies and partners up their game even more? Are these important steps, but is there more to do in your view? What do we do next?
Yeah, thank you for asking it that way. We've come a long way, frankly, longer than, it wasn't just me, there was like a chorus of us
I know.
calling for this, and thankfully the chorus has won. So for once, we did something really positive on a bipartisan basis in the U.S. Congress. It was pretty fantastic. And look, around the edges, there's probably going to be some money wasted. That's what happens when there's industrial policy. But the direction of the CHIPS Act is exactly right. And let me just describe it in a bit more detail. So the core part of the act actually gives a lot of money, 39 billion, to help the domestic semiconductor industry, especially to build some fabs here in the United States. Now, that's not a whole lot of money. That's probably 3 to 4 months of capital spend in that industry. Not very, this is a hugely capital intensive industry. It also importantly has 11 billion for research and development, which is important. We need to stay at the cutting edge of this. And what's my favorite part of this CHIPS and Science Act is there's a huge amount of funding for better domestic US science and technology R&D. And that is an area where we led the world. Frankly, we were world leading during the entire Cold War. We used to spend 2% of our GDP on federal R&D at the height of the Cold War. It's come down and down and down. Now, private companies spend a lot, but they do it in things that, they care about, the best search algorithm, not necessarily what the national security of the United States should worry about. So that's a really important piece, frankly, probably more important than the subsidies for chips. So we've done a lot, and I think we should congratulate ourselves on that. What's next? The big missing piece, and it's not for lack of trying, is this stuff has to be international. So when I look at the export controls in the US, they're now pretty tough, especially on things like semiconductor equipment going to China. But what happens if the American companies can't sell to the Chinese semiconductor companies? Well, then the Dutch sell, or the Japanese sell, or the Korean sell.
Yeah.
So the next thing is to really have a strategy that incorporates our allies in really targeted, small, narrow things. And I want to say this this is a very important point. We don't want to cut off all technological trade with China. We don't want to cut off all tech cooperation with China. We're not going to be an island. We all benefit when we do a lot of these things together, but there's certain really cutting edge things and things that are at the intersection of national security and technology that we need to be a little more careful about.
This is the small yards, tall fences concept, basically.
Right.
Is that what you're describing?
That's right. We've built a bigger yard, and in some ways to the detriment of our own industry.
Yeah. We've got questions coming in on Ukraine, and it's also the one topic I wanted to talk to you about that we haven't hit yet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ukraine here, and we'll hit some of the listeners' questions. Obviously, a serious crisis there. President Putin, as everyone knows, launched this unprovoked invasion of the sovereign country of Ukraine. Largest land war in Europe since World War II. We're more than 6 months into it. 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died. Ukraine government estimates put that figure there. 40,000 Russians reportedly have died. The war has wreaked havoc on the global economy, putting pressure on energy prices. In particular, it's taken a toll on European economy. China, for its part, has adopted this fairly nuanced, or what they describe as a sort of a balanced approach. They've condemned NATO and the U.S., not Russia, for provoking the conflict. They maintain as much economic cooperation as they can with Russia without violating the sanctions. And they've stopped short of providing Russia with military aid. Nevertheless, China and Russia continue to engage. They're engaging in military drills. They've got these Vostok exercises going to be held next week. You've written about this as well. 2018, you wrote in The Atlantic that a true Chinese-Russian axis is still far from reality. And I want to check with you first to see if that is still your view, because the relationship's gotten even stronger since 2018. How strong do you see the China-Russia relationship right now? Is it growing stronger, or is it growing weaker in the context of the war in Ukraine? What's your sense on that?
It's growing stronger, and 4 years is a long time since that article was written. And, part of what the West has done since 2018 is frankly create incentives for China and Russia to get closer together because both have been more isolated by the West. That's not to say that we could have done it necessarily in a different way, but the most worrying part that's new about Russia and China, the eternal friendship and the all-weather friendship, is how closely their general staffs coordinate and how closely their militaries coordinate. It used to be sort of exercises that didn't mean much. Now I think they mean a little bit more. But, this is a very volatile time in the international system, and a lot can happen. I'm not sure if we're talking 4 years from now, whether we'll have an axis of China and Russia, or whether the Chinese will have a little bit of buyer's remorse that they attach themselves so closely to Vladimir Putin, who is, showing himself to be a homicidal maniac. and they may regret a little bit that they are so closely attached to him in particular, rather than to Russia. So remains to be seen. You laid out perfectly what's going on behind the scenes between China and Russia. We read them the Riot Act. So as best we can tell right now, they're not yet supplying military materiel to the Russians, which is good. When I talk to the extent I still can, to Chinese businessmen, Chinese financiers, they're more focused on the West. They don't see Russia as a very big or growing market. And so they'd rather not have secondary sanctions placed on them. That means they won't be able to do business with the West. So let's keep it that way.
And on this question, in your view, how should the U.S. respond to this China-Russia alignment? Should the U.S. treat China and Russia as an immutable alliance and therefore try to confront both of them at the same time? Or should the U.S. treat their challenges differently and maybe try to leverage any differences between them to drive wedges between them? What's your sense? Yeah,
absolutely. The second part. Look, right now, you're not seeing a lot of wedges, but they'll come up. There'll be difficulties in the relationship. And I think right now we're rightfully opposing Russia with all our might, short of going to war with them. That is the right thing to do. We are being very careful about China. And I just want to say this again. I think from the US side, there is an open hand there to work with China and to manage our differences. Nobody that I know in the US government wants a war with China or wants conflict. So, and frankly, no one wants war with Russia either. So I think treating them as an immutable alliance doesn't do us any favors.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes. Couple questions from the audience. One on the political events coming up here in the fall. We've got the Chinese 20th Party Congress, and the United States has its midterm elections. And there's a couple questions in here about the impact of those two events on the bilateral relationship. How do you see or expect relations to shift or evolve once, or will they, or will things stay the same once we get beyond those two events? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, great question. And Paul, you know this as well as I do, but very hard for both sides to have real meaningful conversations between their leaders before those two big political events happen. I worry that if the Republicans win both the House and the Senate's looking less and less likely, but if they win both, the Chinese will say, well, Biden is out of steam. He's a lame duck. We're just going to wait him out. And it'll be hard to get anything done, even in the last 2 years of a Biden administration. I think that would be a mistake because there's a lot of work that we and China can and must do together. So I would encourage our Chinese friends to keep the dialogue open or to reopen the dialogue because this is our best chance really to find a managed way through these continual crises. You know, from the the party Congress that's coming up, it's looking pretty clear that Xi Jinping is going to get his third term. Underneath that, who's on the standing committee? Looks like they're going to be mostly allies of Xi, but no one knows. There's a lot of Kremlinology happening there that I won't get into right now. But I think it's just the problem with both of our political calendars is that makes it very hard for both sides to do business in a thoughtful way.
We've got a couple questions on the Middle East. I want to sort of combine them. I've seen reports that should suggest Xi is going to go to Saudi Arabia as his first overseas trip since the pandemic began. As you know, Anja, in recent years, Beijing's been making diplomatic and economic inroads into the Middle East through its Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time as the U.S. shifts its focus to the Indo-Pacific, and now, of course, the war in Ukraine. What do you make of China's strategy to gain influence in the Middle East, and how can the U.S., what should the United States do to respond or to step up its game?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, or the questioner is absolutely right, that the countries in the Middle East, especially the Sunni kingdoms, are being courted by China, by Russia, and by the United States. And the U.S. should not take its eye off the ball in that particular region. I think the Emirates in particular felt very upset when, after those big attacks from the Yemenis, funded by Iran, we didn't do very much. And memories are long in the Middle East, and people have been quite offended. So I think Biden's trip there did a little bit to repair relations. But I'm in the Middle East quite a bit, and I worry that there's a lack of trust now. There's a feeling that the United States will talk to the Sunni kingdoms when it's convenient for us, but criticize them publicly in ways that I would find appropriate and understandable, but when it's not convenient. And China doesn't do that. China just wants to trade. And they bring a lot of investment. I've seen it. They bring a lot of infrastructure. And it's understandable for the Middle East to want to hedge their bets. It's understandable for them to have a reasonable relationship with Russia. So I think rather than seeing this as a pure contest where China's influence wins or US, we've got to understand that this is a complex region. We need to stay engaged. We need to understand what parts of the Middle East we can usefully engage in and help with. And I would say one thing, because I travel there twice or so a year for commercial reasons. And so I see a part of the Middle East that never gets expressed in US newspapers, I would say. And that is a vibrant middle class that's not focused on oil, young tech startups, people just trying to live a normal life. And we're not engaging those people. The Chinese are, right? And so to see that other side of the Middle East, of people just trying to make it happen, I think would do us a lot of good.
In our final minute, I'm going to continue on the globe and try to squeeze in around the globe, try to squeeze in one more question. Africa is another region where China has prioritized diplomatic and economic efforts. Recently, China supported the African Union's bid to gain a seat at the G20, which I found interesting. China-Africa ties are often based on common understanding of developing countries. China and many countries in Africa, of course, see themselves as developing countries. And many countries in the region have signed the Belt and Road MOUs. There's also a strategic angle to China-Africa relations. The continent is rich, as you know, in natural resources, and it's supposed to be the most populous region in the world by 2050. What, in your view, I mean, how have you seen China's relations with Africa evolve, and how should the U.S. be thinking about this? And how should the U.S. be thinking about competing, frankly, in an increasingly important but often neglected part of the world?
Right. Perfect question to end on. Africa is critically important, and same issue. When you look at the US news, it's usually talking about the Chinese influence there, the environmental degradation, the poverty. When I go to Africa, you see that, but you also see a burgeoning middle class, you see tech startups, you see young people trying to be part of the world economy. Let's engage that Africa, and let's do it consistently, because those guys don't want corrupt contracts, right? And yes, the Belt and Road is very important in Africa, and the Chinese have made a lot of inroads, but you can also in a lot of ways see the pendulum swinging back. I mean, when you go to South Africa 5 years ago and how close they were to the Chinese versus now, it's a sea change. And if we continue to engage the parts of African societies that want to grow themselves in a normal way, that don't want corruption, that don't want environmental degradation, I think we're going to be just fine.
Well, Anja, in 45 minutes, we covered a lot. And we talked Taiwan, Ukraine, U.S. China, Trump, Biden, Africa, Middle East, gone around the globe. And I really want to thank you for your time and for a terrific discussion. And I look forward to having you back out in Beijing when we can get back to in-person events there. But thank you very much for joining the discussion. It's always a pleasure.
I'd love that. Thank you, Paul. And thank you all for being on this morning.
Thanks to everyone for listening. And remember, we'll post this as an episode of our China and the World podcast. And you'll be able to go see the whole recording if you didn't catch all of it. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.